Thank you to TransLink for having me here today, and thank you to SFU as well for hosting us and organizing this event. And thank all of you for coming out this evening despite the fire alarm. I'm wondering, maybe one of you pulled it here. You want to just delay me a little bit. We're going to have to switch the slides here. Which is me thinking out loud, which is a very important thing to announce to all of you. There we go. So I will start by saying that we are at the cusp of a revolution. And then I will say that I'll probably be wrong. Because these kinds of forecasts don't tend to come true the way we anticipate them. But signs are there that there may be some sort of transportation and also a housing revolution, right? And it starts, perhaps, with this millennial generation. These millennials making decisions a little bit differently about where they want to live, how they want to get around the city. So this evening, what I want to do is I want to define millennials, and that's what millennials call a mashup. I think that's what that is all about. I'm going to define millennials, and I want to talk a bit about that link between generational and societal change, and why, when generations change, we see also change in society, and how those two things are linked. Then I want to talk a bit about this new, playing field that's happening. People don't make decisions in a vacuum, right? They make it in a particular context, and that context is changing and already has changed. So when we talk about millennials, for instance, taking transit more often, it's not just a choice, right? It's a decision that they're able to make within a context of more transit availability. There's also changing demographies, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Then we're going to look at where young adults live and how that's changed over time and how that impacts their transportation behavior. And also sort of look at what does it mean for the way we plan cities, right, and the way we plan transportation. So anybody want to change their self-identified generation at this point? So we got sort of millennials, post-1980s, Gen X, 65 to 80, baby boomers, 46 to 64, silent, 28 to 45. That's funny for the wrong reasons. And if you've got any questions about whether you fit, which one you fit in, you can go to the Pew Research Center at the web link down here and take the quiz just like I have done, and identify yourself as a, silent, baby boomer, Gen X, or millennial. As you can see, I'm 50% millennial. I was born in a year that's actually, well, we can call it a boundary year, or just before the boundary year. And suddenly, sometimes societally, we sort of think, well, asking people their age is sort of not the most appropriate thing to do in all occasions. And in a job interview, it's even illegal, right? But when I started researching this, people become more interested. Well, how old are you? So I just thought I'd put up this slide, and it sort of answers the question. I'm half millennial. When last week I was speaking to a reporter from the Vancouver Sun, and she was also, what I've now newly coined, a part of a border generation, and we kind of realized we all have this kind of generational identity crisis. Am I Gen X? Am I millennial? I grew up with typewriters. That's how I learned to type. But then I also had the internet later on. So what am I, right? So it's sort of an identity question. And the whole point of that is, of course, these boundaries are not clear-cut, right? These are not naturally defined boundaries. They're socially constructed. And we can shift them one way or the other a little bit. And that's not really the point of defining these generations. When I took to Google, right, which is, maybe that's my 50% millennial, I take to Google first, and you put in millennials live, and some of the things that then Google auto-completes for you is that millennials live in cities with parents at home and in the moment. So then I thought, well, if we're going to do some generational comparisons, let's also try the baby boomers, right, and see what happens there. They live longer, they live to work, they are attending Live Well Expos, and apparently they have issues with liver disease. But I'm not here to speak about disease of the liver. Who are the millennials? Well, we sort of defined that a little bit, and one nuance I want to add to this is that I often refer to young adults in my research to be between 25 and 34. The reason I do that is because in our mid-20s, and that's shifted over time as well, but it's the mid-20s and into the early 30s where people are making sort of more of those long-term decisions, right? Before 25, a large share of young adults are still in school, and because I am, as a researcher, I'm interested in housing decisions, things like home ownership and their commuting patterns. I sort of have to look at an age range where people actually start doing those things rather than, getting to school. And again, here's sort of the Gen X and the baby boomer generations. Now, if we want to look at some of the numbers, right, this is kind of interesting. So if we define millennials as broadly as we do the baby boomers, we actually see the millennial generation is potentially larger. Of course, we won't know till a bit into the future whether we'll have to sort of split the millennials in half as early and late millennials. That's going to be a tough one tonight to say over and over again. Into a subgroup, but interestingly enough, right, it's 26% of Canada's population fits into that, and sort of half of that is young adult, half of that population, compared to just over the 9 million baby boomers. Millennials in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver, they're about 27% of the population and about 31% of the city of Vancouver. Speaks to their somewhat more urban location, as we'll see later in the presentation. Why do generations differ, right? So first we want to sort of take a step back and say, well, if we're going to use generation as a mode of analysis, right, we can sort of cut society various ways and say we're going to analyze people by income, by ethnicity, in demographic terms. If we're going to use generation, why do we believe that generations differ in the first place? And the argument is that generations differ because they grow up in a very different societal context, right? Different things happen when young people are growing up in different time periods, right? So earlier when I was talking about growing up with a typewriter and then having the internet later on, many of you who are saying you're millennials will have grown up with the internet as an integral part of how you communicate. It shapes how you work and how you maybe want to get around because you want to maybe be texting, right, and not walking into things. So something like a bus is a good idea because you can sit on it, get places, and still tweet your friends, right? So this is why we think generations differ, is because they're shaped by a particular temporal period. This is where I also add a bit of nuance, though, because I don't want to say all millennials or all baby boomers, for that matter, are the same, right? So a millennial from Mumbai will probably have less in common with a millennial from Vancouver than a baby boomer from Vancouver and a millennial from Vancouver have in common. So we have to sort of be careful when we generalize in this way to remember not all millennials are the same, right? We're looking at them in a particular context. And people refer to things like Divorce Act, these changes, meaning a lot of them, or a larger share of the millennials were growing up in households where parents split up, and what that then meant for their living arrangements and transportation patterns. Growth in the labor force, in the female labor force, meaning more dual income earner households, higher educational attainment, and so forth, that lead to these kind of things. And of course, the emergence of technology. This picture is actually people taking pictures of the Olympic torch during the Vancouver Olympics, and I just sort of stood behind them, and I couldn't see the torch, but I could see people's cell phones. So then if we want to link societal and generational changes, I go to a very scientific literature, Back to the Future. Who here has seen Back to the Future? Oh, many of you. My wife will say I've seen it a few too many times. I really love that movie. But in that movie, Michael J. Fox, who's Marty McFly, is on a stage, much like this, at a dance in the 50s, I think it is, when he goes back in time. And he gets the guitar and he plays some really hardcore rock, right? And then everybody stops dancing and just kind of gives him a stare. What is he doing? And what he says is, I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet, but your kids are going to love it. And that really sort of encompasses, what this sort of more abstract graphic shows, is that things that one generation thought was weird, edgy, not the norm, becomes the norm over time as young adults and young people integrated into the workplace, into their living arrangement, right? They get used to it because they grew up with it. A couple examples are things like tattoos. There's a lot of sort of speculation around whether or not tattoos are appropriate for the workplace. But one thing that, and I'm not here to make a decision one way or the other, but certainly there's more tattoos to be seen these days, right? Because they're not quite as edgy as they once were, right? And so that changes with generations. And real estate developers in this city will tell you, well, condos at one point were seen as a risky investment. People had their parents telling them, don't buy these condo things, they're new, we don't know what they are all about. Well, fast forward 20, 30 years in Vancouver, and we know condos are, have become more of a norm than they are at the margin, and are likely not more risky than some of the other segments of the housing market. I touched upon this briefly before, and I want to go back to it again, sort of this danger of generalizations, right? And I want to make the point that when I speak about millennials, or when we speak about any generation, we do so, and I do so, to help facilitate greater intergenerational understanding. And now, why is that important? I think it's important that, and there's obviously evidence behind this, that we understand each other as a society, different groups in society. And now the argument has been made that society today is changing more quickly than it has in the past. We can use the example and say somebody in 1890 and somebody in or in 1900, they're going to have experienced different things. But even just think about somebody in the 1980s and the 1990s, what happened during those 10 years in terms of technological progress that altered so many things. The argument is that generations, of course, were always different, right? People always had this saying, oh, kids these days, right? They do all these crazy things and we don't understand it. That's not new. That's not what I'm here to talk about, right? We all know that generations differ. The argument is that generations differ more and they change more quickly because of the pace of societal change itself. And what that has the potential to do is that we'll understand each other less because things change so quickly. And so I think generational research can help build mutual understanding among groups. Now the terms you're seeing up here, ageism and generationalism, which is sort of more newly coined, are basically when you take these generalizations we make about a group, maybe it's millennials living at home, or maybe it's baby boomers with liver disease, right? If we then use them as a basis of discrimination and stereotyping, it becomes ageism, which is the discrimination based on age, which we often only associated with discrimination against the elderly, but of course it's along the whole spectrum of age, right? There's discrimination against young as well as old. And it's, as others have pointed out in the literature, it's a kind of a perplexing form of discrimination because it's the only form of discrimination where we actually discriminate against past or future selves, right? We were all generally at different age groups. So again, we have to be careful that we don't use these generalizations about millennials, baby boomers, and so forth. In the press, you see people being called lazy, entitled, and so forth. Interesting discussion, perhaps, but I don't see a great value in it because I think those kind of discussions don't get us very far. We can argue all night here about which generation worked harder, and I don't think that's going to get us very far. Rather, if we can understand each other better and say, well, this generation has these kind of needs and this generation has these kind of needs, we can avoid having greater societal divisions. So that's sort of the spirit with which I approach generational research. So let's get a bit more at the meat of the presentation in terms of the transportation side of things. And I start, of course, I say of course because in my world, housing and transportation are very closely linked, right? And so I start here by showing you how young adults are living in Canada's 3 largest metropolitan areas in terms of their housing types, right? And one thing that's very interesting about this is that look at Vancouver in terms of single-family dwellings, right? The young adults have the lowest share of single-family dwelling living in this metropolitan area compared to Toronto and Montreal. This is also, I found that very interesting, right? Sometimes in popular dialogue, we sort of speak about Vancouver as being the high-rise condo city. Of course, not every more than 5 stories isn't necessarily 20 or 30 stories, but certainly here we see that Toronto, has this sort of has grown into this sort of high-rise downtown, whereas in Vancouver, a lot more of the millennials are actually living in something that's less than 5 stories. So we're talking row houses, low-rise apartment buildings, and so forth. So this is kind of an interesting development because we sometimes, as planners, we worry that when we speak about density, that people will necessarily think high-rises. And don't get me wrong, there's a place for high-rises in every city, but maybe it shouldn't be the entire metropolitan region, right? And so, sort of building towards more of this sort of 5-story or less than 5-story, or maybe less than 10, where these cutoffs are dictated by the census, so we can't sort of play around with them here in the stats. But lower rise, right, mid-rise, but it doesn't have to be single-family dwelling, which we know is associated with more land consumption and so forth. Now let's look at the changes just in Vancouver, right? This is astonishing again to me because in 1986, we've had over 40% of young adults in this metropolitan area living in single-family homes, and this goes down to less than 20, right? And it's growth here in the less than 5 stories, and it's growth in the high-rises as well. So a dramatic shift in where people live, and this links, of course, very directly to how they get around, how they use transportation options because of that link between transportation and housing decisions. Also what's changed, of course, is that the city itself, the region itself has changed, right? A lot of development in planning and also international events, geopolitical events that shaped Vancouver. In terms of the planning things that happened, we've sort of got the development of the SkyTrain, the agricultural land reserve, and the livable region plan, as well as then things like more recently the Canada Line that sort of have made a commitment to investing in transit, made a commitment to try and constrain urban growth and create a denser urban metropolitan area for the sake of livability and environmental sustainability. And then we have things like investment associated with the sort of expo, and then the return of Hong Kong to Chinese rule that brought a lot of foreign investment here as well. So the whole point about all this is that when we talk about young adults in the past and today, a whole lot has changed, right? So it's not just the young adults are different, but the context has changed, so they're able to make different kinds of decisions. In the 60s and 70s, it was more difficult to buy a high-rise condo apartment in the city because there were fewer of them, right? It was more difficult to take the SkyTrain in the 60s because you would have been walking over, land, not on an actual SkyTrain because it wasn't built till much later. Now, along with that, right, so the metropolitan area has grown, there's been a lot of investment. We're also then seeing changes in affordability. And what I've highlighted for you here, which I know, most of you will be familiar with in Vancouver, this story about, affordability. So this is the percentage of young adults spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And that's used by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation as an affordability cutoff. And we see that Vancouver, this is a bit dated because of the way Census Administration works. And so we're seeing 38, but Toronto not too far in behind, right? But Montreal, more affordable, has to do with a bit of the decline that's happening there. But interestingly, ownership, going up, right? So we're seeing young adults have more affordability issues, but the rate of ownership going from 39% to 44% over this 20-year period. And the condo is in part what made this change possible, right? The condo, even though located in a very expensive location, in terms of per area land value, gives you some small space that comes at a lower total price, right? So young adults are more able to enter the housing market in some ways because they can afford the condo. Now, we increasingly thought the condo was a wise choice, right? And we sort of got all hot and steamy about the condo. And then we sort of realized maybe we've gone a little too bananas with condos and home ownership, and suddenly we're faced with, these kind of questions, right? Do we have too much debt? Do millennials carry more debt than other generations? And what are the implications of a rise in interest rates, right? So young adults in high numbers entering home ownership in a period right now where interest rates are very low. What's going to happen when interest rates, those of you buying houses in the 80s will remember interest rates in the double digits, right? And now we're sort of getting deals around, 1 to 2 plus prime. Huge difference. And what are the implications of that as young adults enter home ownership, and the affordability question will become very apparent if interest rates rise, and what does that then mean for a city or a metro region where people have made that investment in a condo? Who are the young adults? That's of course changed, right? These are the demographic changes I was talking about earlier. Of course, we know the changes that have happened towards more education, more women in the labor force, a larger share that's never been married, right? So it's a dramatic shift to that. People living in non-family or multiple family households. So what this means is they're either living on their own, or it could also mean they're living with roommates, which is sort of a growing phenomenon among young adults for affordability reasons, for sort of socializing reasons as well. And then you've got a growth in, in couples living without kids, right? And there's questions still out there in the literature. Are people not wanting to get married anymore? Are millennials, anti-establishment in that sense? And do they not want to have kids anymore, or not as many? And, sort of the early evidence suggests that maybe it's not a sort of millennials aren't necessarily giving up on the concept of marriage, but that they're delaying it much later, so we just haven't seen the numbers go up because people are getting married later in life and they're having kids later in life. And we're going to return to that a little bit because we want to then see what the implications are of that on transportation patterns. The other piece of this, so we've sort of got the urban context, we've got the metropolitan area, right? We've got the housing market changes, we've got the demographic changes. Then there's sort of these economic changes, right, in the labor market that have also happened during this sort of last 20, 30 years, between when the baby boomers were young adults and when now the millennials are young adults. And an important development has been sort of this notion around labor market insecurity. There are more contract jobs, there are more flexible jobs, and people are expected to hold a higher number of jobs over a lifetime. What the implications of that have been is that people are now, including myself, are able to show in the data that there has been a decline in millennials' income if you compare them to a statistically equivalent person 20, 30 years ago. So there's been a growth in young adults earning less than $24,000, and there's a decrease in the real income, so adjusted for inflation, of young adults over this time period, and there's a growth in the generational income gap. Now, the generational income gap always exists, right? You're not surprised to learn that a young person earns less than an older person, especially if the young person is just starting out. But what is an interesting indicator is how that gap between younger and older generations changes over time. And we've seen growth in that to some extent. And maybe in the recent years, actually stabilization a little bit. But we have seen some growth in that. And what that means is that there's, the gap in spending power is changing, so that baby boomers might be more likely to outbid, so to speak, millennials in the housing market, which sort of goes back to the affordability piece among millennials. Are they able to afford the locations that they desire? Income inequality has grown, as we've heard from many other sources. This is actually income inequality among young adults. And it's important to note that income inequality has increased in the Vancouver metro region across generations as well as within generations. And so when we talk about the baby boomers, for instance, we have to recognize that they're not all wealthy and equity rich. As they're sometimes portrayed, same with the millennials. They're not all starving students who are sort of jumping from job to job. They're quite well-to-do millennials. So again, we sort of have to think about how do we take apart this millennial population and look at the needs and demands of different kinds of millennials or baby boomers. Now, how does this translate into changes in transportation mode, right? And some of these changes I was quite fascinated by because we're looking at a fairly short temporal frame. And so if we look at changes in car use among people 18 to 24-year-olds, and this comes from the TransLink Trip Diary survey, we've seen a decrease from 63 to 50% car use, an increase from 32 to 42% in transit use, stability in cycling, and an increase in walking. So some dramatic shift in terms of the percentages of how young people are getting around. Part of that story has to do, of course, with the changing infrastructure, right? So we have things like this, the City of Vancouver talking about having over 265 kilometers of bike network. So there's this sort of interesting piece about public transit and how it's very connected to walking and cycling because, people walk or cycle to transit generally. Some people drive. There's sort of those kind of Metropolitan commuter trains. We have a bit less of that in Vancouver than in other cities. But so the walking piece is very interesting because this is where Vancouver's done some amazing things, because when we look at the metro population, that's 12%, the downtown, the regional downtown, which you can sort of define as an inner city, so not just the downtown peninsula where we are now, but also parts of the city of Vancouver. We're looking at the rest of the city of Vancouver. We're looking at 39%, and if we just look at downtown, we got 74% of the population walking to work, right? Wow. Sometimes you hear these numbers, and if I just showed you these numbers, you might have said, oh, that must be Paris or London or some city that had a transit system for a long time and has this kind of density where people walk to work. But no, it's a North American city, right? This stereotype of North American cities, if we group them all together, being auto-dependent, of course not being true. And you can compare these numbers to New York, for instance, and you can see that at the metro level, we're actually doing better, and even at the sort of regional inner city. Of course, we have to remember that Manhattan is much larger than our downtown peninsula, but also that Manhattan has, of course, a very elaborate subway system, so that when we look at non-car percentage, sort of on the bottom right there, 84%, right? So there are a lot of people getting around without the use of the car. But the piece here where we're sort of linking land use and transportation is this notion of density, right? And I'm showing here some of the condo towers from Vancouver, but I also want to point out right away that it doesn't have to be this kind of high-rise density, right? Density of all kind facilitates more walking, cycling, and transit than if you have this sort of very low density, what we traditionally associated with suburban environments. Of course, we know suburbs are diverse and there are dense suburbs. But in a general sense, it's this density that allows people to walk to work because they're inherently more close to a higher number of destinations, right? So we can't really forget about that sort of walking and cycling piece when we talk about shifting people away from cars to transit. This question, has sort of come up in the media a lot. Have cars lost their cool? And we've seen some stats that have come also out of a TransLink survey where, when we look at 2011, 16 to 19-year-olds had 50% of them had a driver's license, and 20 to 29-year-olds, 80% had a driver's license. So I would point out that, this is still a fairly large percent of them have a driver's license. But what's really changed is that that's a 10% decrease since 1999 in both of those groups. And so then people start to speculate, right? What are the factors that are leading to this decline in why people are taking or not getting their driver's license? And of course, with like any of these changes, it's never just one factor. But we could point to the economics, right? Earlier, I've told you about sort of the declining incomes of millennials or the lower incomes. So cars are expensive, right? So you may not buy them as early on as previous generations were able to. Some people have speculated about the environmental attributes, so suggesting that younger generations today place higher emphasis on making choices that are less impactful on the environment. I think the jury on that is still out, whether that motivational factor is truly there. I haven't really seen the research on that. It's more sort of from the press where that's discussed. And then we could sort of talk about the availability of transit, right? And that transit is just more available to a higher share of young adults than it was 20, 30 years ago. Young adults are also sort of growing up in a very different context. More of them are going to university, and because of that, more of them are having bus passes when they're going to school, right? So they're sort of having that transit experience during that age range, which could contribute to them not getting a driver's license because they're going to school and live close to the campus, have a bus pass, so why do I need to get a car, right? So when we go back to this question, right, we sort of talk about costs, the high-density living, the environment, and then sort of growing up with the transit. But one additional factor that I've only come across in one survey, but people have talked about it a bit, but this survey actually surveyed young adults or millennials in the US, the American Public Transit Association, and what they suggest is that millennials are highly pragmatic, and they use terms like multimodal, right, and digital socializing. And what that really, means in concrete terms is that millennials will use, they're arguing, the trip or the mode of transport that's most convenient for the trip they want to take right now, right? And if that's the bus, that's what they'll take. If that's the LRT, that's what they'll take. If that's walking, that's what they'll take. So it's sort of an interesting perspective because it suggests that you don't have to convince them to take transit or use those other modes. You just have to make it convenient for them so that they can get to the places they want to get. If that's the most practical mode, then that's what they'll do. Also, this survey suggests, and I strongly agree with them, is that transit agencies in general have not, to a great extent, marketed the sort of ability to work while you're on transit. Some do, but millennials are really telling us that they want to be able to socialize while they're on transit. They want to be able to work, maybe read something, and you're able to do that, right? You can try and walk and text, and then usually, your head goes into some other person, and they'll give you a dirty look. Or you can cycle and text, but it doesn't work so well. And then you can drive and text, and then you might get a ticket, right? So that's illegal for good reasons. But you can sit on the bus and text, or on the SkyTrain and text, and it's perfectly okay because you're sitting down, you're able to do it. Maybe if you have loud cell phone conversations, that's sort of become something a little bit annoying on transit. But that's the personal story. But the notion that transit is able to facilitate a different use of the time, right? You don't have to be engaged in operating the vehicle that's getting you around. You can do other things. And if transit agencies, I think, can use that and say, well, when you're on the bus, you can text your friends. When you're in the car, you'll get a ticket, right? So I think that's a key marketing strategy or an element of strategy to get younger people onto transit. And other generations as well, I think. And I'm going to just go on a small detour here, not a long detour, just a short one. Earlier on, we had a reception before this meeting, and we talked a little bit about voting, right? When Gordon was asking about what age range people are in, it sort of occurred to me we should also ask, or when you're asking who's running for the next election, we should also ask who's planning on voting in the next election, right? And I always say that to my students at the University of Waterloo is vote, right? If you don't vote, then your say is not there in the future of our cities, right? And so this is a sort of a real issue. Is millennials have particular preferences, but if you don't vote, people might not listen to you in the same way that they would otherwise, right? You're a large group. If you vote, people will start to listen. Back to the city aspect of it, though, and of course the voting patterns are quite linked to that. A term that maybe somebody should Google it to make sure that I'm not claiming something's not true, but I will say a term that I have coined is the youthification of cities. And of course, it's a sort of a play on that word gentrification, right? That dirty word we don't like to say because, we don't want to turn away investment, but at the same time, we're not so happy sometimes what happens to people who had lived for a long time in the neighborhoods that are being gentrified. But why make a variant of gentrification? Well, youthification, I will argue, is a more recent process, and it's connected to very much these sort of demographic transitions that are bringing young people downtown. It's associated with a particular life cycle stage. We've built inner cities that facilitate the young adult lifestyle, right? It's like a campus for young grown-ups. I got everything here. I've got my girlfriend here, I've got my boyfriend here, I've got my work here. I don't need to go anywhere else. This is perfect, right? But look at this phrase, right? For this period in my life. For this period in my life. Now, if I were, thinking about transportation planning, having to make infrastructure investments, I would ask myself, well, these millennials are using transit more, they're biking more, they're walking more. For this period in my life, what can we do to make sure that it's not just this period in my life? What can we do today, right, to build the city where the kind of city where different kinds of households are associated with higher transit use and higher walking and cycling? In some of the academic literature, people talk about the Bridget Jones effect. People know the movie Bridget Jones? Not as many as Back to the Future. That's interesting. Bridget Jones is a 20-something, maybe she's in her early 30s. The actress is probably in her 30s playing somebody in her 20s. As those things usually go in Hollywood. Bridget Jones is a single young adult living with roommates, consumption-oriented lifestyle. It's about eventually finding that guy she'll settle down with, but for now, I want to live in the city with this diverse group of friends and roommates, and the friends kind of become a pseudo-family because you're living away from your relatives that are family. So it sort of creates this new life cycle stage where you're basically there to enjoy yourself, right? Living in the moment. There's probably some truth to what Google tells us. Living in the moment, and that kind of lifestyle, living in the moment, living in the in the pub, living on the beach, hiking the mountains, right? That life cycle stage is very well facilitated by downtown living, by transit, by walking, by cycling. And so we suddenly have this match between the kind of city we built and the kind of sort of cultural and societal changes that have happened where young adults are moving to cities and downtowns, to be particular, in larger numbers. So we've talked about youthification, and now let's have a look at where this is happening. And so we can look at New York City, for instance. Interestingly enough, when we look at the percentage of young people living in different areas, we don't have to worry too much about the exact numbers here. Just use a location quotient for those of you more statistically inclined. But basically, the darker the colors, the higher the share of young adults. And so, we've got places like Manhattan, maybe not too surprising, but we've also sort of then got Queens and Brooklyn, and even parts of Jersey City, right? And these areas here have a lot to do with housing costs. So Manhattan becomes too expensive. Some millennials, young adults, are able to live there. Others have to move to other neighborhoods over here that have become trendy. And even New Jersey, right, has now a trendy neighborhood. Wow. Seattle, not too far from here, right? So same kind of pattern. It's young adults are in the downtown, the central business district. Neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, where there's lots of restaurants, cafes, trendy stores, places like Ballard, which I may be mistaken, but isn't that Kurt Cobain, or somewhere around here Kurt Cobain was from? There's a music scene there, right? I make that reference because that location of young adults is tied very closely to the music and cultural scenes, right? Some, can't forget, right? Some concentrations also in the suburbs. But remember, this kind of geography here uses census areas. So the lower the population densities, the larger these neighborhoods get. So out here, this will look more important because it's a low-density area. But in here, you've got a lot more population. So there's way more young adults living here than out here. Yeah. High tech, yeah. Thanks for that, yeah. Now, Detroit, right? So let's look at a city that's not doing so well economically. And so if we look sort of at its inner area, well, we don't see that presence of the young adults, right? We see them sort of scattered through different parts of the metropolitan region. We don't see the same association of centrality, urbanity, and the presence of these young people. Toronto, in the 70s downtown, again, 2011, we've got much higher concentration. All this down here is pretty much high-rise condos, and this is what I'm now calling the youthification of cities, is the influx of young adults. And it's a youthification, not a gentrification, but the two aren't mutually exclusive. Both can happen at the same time. But it's youthification because young adults of all income levels are moving downtown. It's not just like in the case of gentrification, we're assuming it's sort of a social upgrading. A lot of millennials are moving downtown and renting, right? A lot of millennials are moving downtown and living with roommates for affordability issues. So it's not just a social upgrading as gentrification would suggest. So hence the term youthification that I think adds something useful to the discussion. These are a little small, but in general, we've got sort of 6 Canadian metropolitan areas, and all of them we're sort of seeing a centralization of young adults living more in the center. What's interesting, though, is when you get sort of to the smaller metropolitan areas like Quebec City, for instance, you're seeing more older adults downtown, so more of the baby boomers, and a few more young adults sort of suburbanizing. So this youthification is a bit more of a big city, big metropolitan trend than it is a medium and small city size trend. But what's very interesting about Vancouver, and I'll get to that in the next slide as well, is that see here how I use a circle to sort of designate most of these cities, but I use this sort of oval to talk about young adults in Vancouver, and that's because young adults in Vancouver are not just living in the downtown. They're living along transit lines, and that's how Vancouver really stood out among other cities in this research, because it's the draw isn't just downtown. The draw is how close am I to rapid transit. Now, if we look at Vancouver over time, we sort of see this centralizing tendency, right? 1981, some of the concentrations out here. Of course, already some young adults living in places like Kitsilano and False Creek. And then, in 2006, this inner area becoming where all the high-density stuff is. It's a bit tough to see on this map just because there are that many neighborhood or census areas with data in this inner area. And then these concentrations along the SkyTrain lines, right? And then a few out in Surrey that remain. But also here, right at the transit terminal on the North Shore as well. So there's really a neat correlation between the presence of young adults and where there are town centers and transit. Right? Now, we've been able to update this to 2011 census data because this comes from age data comes from the short form. Of course, the long form is gone, which makes a lot of this research a lot more difficult. I always have to do that plug, right? But what we see in the 2011 data since the 2006, which is a really interesting development, is growth in here, right, in Surrey. And so there's more young adults sort of happening, growth in young adult segment in Surrey. And I've been trying to figure out a little bit more about why that's happening. And I think in the development and real estate industry, I've been hearing things about, well, the millennials, they liked downtown living, but now they just need an extra bedroom, right? Because some of them are having kids. And discussion sometimes then goes to, well, how much space do you need to raise a family? And we can then get into all sorts of value-laden discussions about what is enough space. But we can sort of boil it down and say, well, bedrooms might matter. So if we want to set aside the space discussion, we can say number of bedrooms may matter. And we can say, okay, maybe a 1-bedroom, it's difficult to raise a family of 4 within the sort of context of North America and what people might be willing to do. So people are moving further out because they can get more bedrooms for their money, right? And so then this really raises the question, are we going to lose some of these transit benefits that millennials have initially had? Just to give you some visuals from Toronto and Ottawa, this is sort of a neat contrast. When I took some of the highest concentrations of where millennials live and sent out one of my grad students, Robert Walter Joseph, to take some photos, this is Toronto, Queen Street, and down by the water, young adult neighborhoods. And I also sent them, we have these sort of for most of the cities, but I've just chosen Ottawa here for contrast. This is where the highest concentrations of baby boomers are found, right? So very contrasting living environments. But what I want to highlight here is if I picked Vancouver and wanted to show you some pictures, I can't do that contrast that neatly because in Vancouver, trend, again, is a little bit different. You've got more older adults moving downtown and into higher density areas than in other cities where the young segment really dominates. So something's happening here where you're getting more boomers to live downtown that other cities are struggling a bit more to have happen. Let's compare sort of at the inter-metropolitan scale, right? Young adults where do they go to in terms of cities that they go to? And I was, at first when I did this, I was amazed that, well, first of all, the difference between the top and the bottom is not huge. Let's remember that, right? But in terms of looking at age groups, that difference really never is that huge. So the small sort of 5-6% do matter, and so because they send us signals about what's happening. So we got places like Salt Lake City on top, Austin, right, and then Calgary, Edmonton, sort of related to the growth in the research sector, and we get to Denver, Washington, Seattle. That's too bad. Seattle's above Vancouver, and but at least we beat out Toronto, right? So we're sort of in the middle of the pack. I don't generally like rankings, but just sort of for the point of making the point about where it sits in general, sort of around 24 out of 57. And at the bottom, we got places like Rochester, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Hartford, Detroit, right? And we start to see this picture of metropolitan areas that have young adults are ones that have either established or up-and-coming economies, right? And the ones that don't, well, they're the places where industrial decline has happened, the places that are having difficulty recovering from the loss of a manufacturing sector. So if we're thinking about sort of millennials and attracting a young labor force and economic growth in general, we sort of have to pay attention to what's happening in these cities that are attracting a growing share of the young adult labor force. So then when we look at the youthification of cities as a process, I try to kind of take all this and say, well, how can we sort of talk about this as an overarching process? And we can say, well, those cities that are successful, and we can say that is also true at the neighborhood scale, right, is that are cities that have biking, transit, walkability. So places like Salt Lake City are really promoting some of these things. They have cultural amenities, they have parks, they have oceans, they have lakes, they have mountains, they have singles, they have nightlives, and they have jobs. So this is a kind of an interesting piece of research. So the higher the share of singles, the higher the share of young adults, which there's some of the economics of dating, which I always find a bit awkward research area, because can you really boil it down to the economics? But some people think you can. If you've got the not so successful cities that are transitioning, right, they're still seen as edgy, cool, new. They have low-cost housing, low-cost food, and they're not quite as gentrified. And then you have those in decline, right, which have generally very little expenditure on public amenities. They have manufacturing decline, high unemployment, and no sort of tech sector or new economy. What we find then with this question about jobs, I find this interesting. So I'm going to just comment on that for a second. There's some debate, right, in the literature. What brings people to a place? Is it jobs, or is it all this other stuff up here, the amenities? And Rich of Florida will, of course, tell you it's the amenities now, right? People move for the amenities. And so when you look to some surveys of millennials, and what you find is that millennials will say, well, we're choosing the place first, and then we're going to look for a job after we've chosen the place for the quality of life. And at face value, that sort of supports Richard Florida's argument about people will move where there's lifestyle amenities. I will extend this analysis and say, well, you may move to a place for the lake and the ocean and the mountain, but hiking, grouse grind is not going to put bread on my table, so to speak. So eventually you may leave if you can't get the job. So whether or not jobs or amenities come first is maybe a bit of a chicken and egg kind of question. Should we really worry about teasing those apart? If you only have jobs and no quality of life, you're probably going to attract some, but maybe you have difficulty retaining people. If you only got quality of life and not the jobs, you're not going to attract people either, right? But so if we look at some of this, right, in terms of young adults' living costs, one-bedroom condos, which I'll call the forever young indicator, and I'll talk about in a moment what that means. In the transition cities, you've got medium percentage of young, but living costs still generally low. And then you've got sort of the successful where you've got lots of young adults, but living costs are high. And again, this sort of applies at the metro scale as well as at the neighborhood scale. And what happens, of course, in this, for some of you sort of familiar with the gentrification literature, this is not too different from some of the arguments made about gentrification, that once you get into this area, your success undermines itself because things become too expensive. So if transit is one of the things that draws people, if locations around transit become so expensive, few people can afford them, you're going to lose some people from those transit-intensive areas. This is Neighborhoods Forever Young. again, there's sort of the stats there for some of you who want to see that. I usually find when I give these lectures, people get scared by stats, and so I don't want to scare you too much. What this shows, basically, in a nutshell, is that today's middle-aged adults are not living in the same neighborhoods as they were when they were younger. So they moved out of the neighborhoods where they were when they were younger. What we are seeing is that today's young adults are living in the neighborhoods that also housed young adults in the 1990s and before. So hence the term forever young. People move in when they're young. As they get older, they move out. And we're seeing trends to the contrary. I'm not questioning that because I know there's some trends that are suggesting that's no longer happening. But if this is happening, why am I worried about this? Well, I'm worried about this from sort of a transportation perspective and the planning goals, right, that are aiming to shift us away from the car for good environmental, economic, and social reasons, is that we will see people move away from transit-intensive areas as they get older. So the question becomes, how do we retain them downtown? How do we retain them not just downtown, but also near transit, maybe in suburban areas? And so to answer that, we can sort of say, well, why do millennials choose high-density areas in the first place? Well, it has to do with preferences for an urban lifestyle, the lower cost, smaller housing units, life cycle stage, and sort of the benefit of a central location when you've got a lot of places to be. And then we can say, well, is this factor likely to change as millennials grow older? And we can say, well, maybe their preferences for urban lifestyles actually remain, but their life cycle stage and their sort of ability to afford larger housing as their life cycle stage changes, those factors are going to shift. And so then we can say, well, how do we keep young people in central areas when those things like life cycle stage and housing demand change? And so some policy options, and I, of course, don't have time here to get into detail on all of these, but we can also discuss during question period, is that we can talk about things like bringing urban amenities to the suburbs, right? Bringing transit in greater numbers to the suburbs. And when we're talking about, for instance, the benefit of a central location when faced with lower job security, in part, the downtown, this is the economic theory, would suggest the downtown, the more central location, is better when you're not sure where you got to be in the future, right? And that's true in part because suburb-to-suburb connections are much more difficult to make than downtown, another suburb, or suburb to downtown, right? Whereas suburban transit is usually not as well established. We can think about things like subsidizing larger units, convertible housing where you have small condo units that you buy one, you buy two, you rent one out until you need it, you take down the wall and you've got a larger condo unit. So that the condo can adapt as people's life and family needs change. You can increase density of a peripheral employment areas, and you can sort of require larger units near transit. And this one here is interesting, right? It says expand transit. And I want to qualify that a little bit. The reason is, one of the reasons people move away from transit-intensive areas is because it's expensive there to buy large or rent larger housing units because the accessibility improvements of transit raise the cost of land. Now, if you expand transit to an extent where most of the region is transit accessible, there's not that sort of high demand for every transit location in the region, and you're going to see some locations that have transit and not such high land values. It's a bit of a supply and demand, and I don't think we can boil it down just to that simple analysis. But at the same time, it is true. The more transit stops you're going to provide, the fewer some of them will be not quite as expensive. A unique Vancouver challenge within this, sort of emerged from my research on this, and the finding. This is the first, part up here is more generally true for most North American cities, that people with children tend to have longer commutes and more trips in general. And partly this is still associated because historically, people with children sort of moved to suburban locations because culturally that was sort of defined as the family place. But also has to do with with sort of multiple destinations, right? People having to go to multiple destinations meetings, or dropping off kids at soccer practice, two spouses, one working on this side of town, the other on this side of town, right? So where do you locate to sort of have two commute decisions in place? But what's unique about this for Vancouver is that this effect of people with children having longer commutes is amplified in Vancouver. And so not only do people in Vancouver with children have longer commutes, they have longer commutes and more auto-oriented commutes than in other cities, right? So at first I sort of showed you all these gains in walking and transit use, but they're real. But there's a life cycle stage element in this, right? So how do we get people on transit as they sort of move out of this youthification neighborhood? And part of the reason this is happening, I would argue, is that, and I'm quoting my former PhD supervisor here, is that because in Vancouver, lower housing prices are beyond hope, right? Is what he used to say. And I'm sort of adding to that, or at least beyond the Fraser River, because young people are, to some extent, moving to places like, like Surrey, and to find some of those lower-priced housing. But if you want to, what my research really boils down to is if you want people to keep using transit as they get older and move into different, as the millennials get older and start thinking about having children and expand their household size, is you've got to find a way that you can accommodate slightly larger housing and apartment sizes or townhouses near transit than we currently have available in Metro Vancouver. There's some positive signs here in terms of this happening. We have a number of households with children growing downtown, and so when you just look at the downtown, that number is growing, but when you look at metro households, it's still a smaller share, and to some extent, these tend to be higher income earners, so there's sort of the social equity questions about who can afford to live downtown and near transit that we need to sort of deal with. There's also this research that says people are drawn to the type of area they grew up in, and this sort of can go either way for us in Metro Vancouver. As we mentioned earlier, I also study suburbs, and most millennials in Canada actually grew up in a suburb of a metropolitan area. So if they truly want to go back where they grew up as children, we're in for a very suburban Canada down the road. If we assume their formative years were sort of happening when they were going to university, where they, or college, where they're more likely to live downtown, then we're in for a very high-density living. So it depends what we assume are formative years. It depends in part whether we assume this is a life cycle stage or a true change in demand. And there's the growth of high-density suburban nodes, right? So people can live this, the sort of urban lifestyle while still getting to a more affordable housing unit. Negative signs, some research out of Wilfrid Laurier University has been pointing to particularly ethnic millennials returning to low-density suburbs, in part to be drawn by an ethnic enclave, the presence of an ethnic enclave. So sort of another factor coming into location decisions. And then there's still this sort of cultural debate about what is a good place to raise children, right? You see these debates in the newspapers, some people just saying downtown is not the place to raise kids. And I don't agree with that personally, but that's still out there, that notion that there is a good place to raise children. And then the sort of negative sign too in Vancouver is the cost of housing in high density areas is prohibitive. I'm going to end here sort of returning to the very beginning of my talk where I talked about being at the cusp of a revolution. And I think this revolution could be a quiet revolution, like we've seen previously in Canada and in Quebec in particular. And a quiet revolution being one where suddenly things change in demographics, in the way people get around the city in this case, in the way that people form households and make decisions about those kind of things. And maybe it's a quiet revolution where the bus is just finally cool, right? Or is it going to be the not-so-quiet urban revolution, right? We've seen Occupy movements come in and talk about income inequality, which I've shown in an earlier slide is increasing among the millennials. Millennials are worried about high unemployment, about job insecurity, worried about their future prospects, worried about getting jobs that they've worked for in university and colleges to get qualified for, only to find that they might have to work as a barista, which, there's nothing wrong with that, to quote Seinfeld, right? Some of you got that. But if that's not what you were qualified for when you spent 5-6 years in a post-secondary education, right? So there's opposition to some of these issues, and I put opposition to gentrification because in part now this is sort of an opposition to not being able to live where one desires to live to access things like transit and the urban lifestyle, right? And so this could be a not-so-quiet urban revolution, and this picture here is actually also taken by my former PhD supervisor at the Occupy Vancouver protest, right? It's a nice day for a revolution. Now, I can't tell you whether this is going to be a quiet or not-so-quiet or maybe no revolution at all, but I think what we know about the millennials, the revolution will be tweeted, liked, and shared. And maybe, just maybe, it will happen on the back of a bus. Thank you very much. All right, so questions, comments, disagreements, and maybe state your name and...
Hi, my name is David Godin. I'm an urban planner. And my thoughts and question is regarding the multimodal choices that people are making, where the standard trip diaries or census questions regarding mode to work or mode of travel just really don't capture the diversity of ways people are making their travel decisions these days. And as a researcher and an academic, I'm wondering how the discourse is engaging with this and how we can perhaps even just better communicate that it's okay to not identify with a single mode.
Right, yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, the trends we see or can identify are only as good as the data we have, right? And even, with the loss of the long-form census, we're not even sure how reliable commuting information is anymore in general. I'm not sure if you're getting at this, but, there's sort of a trend that people have identified, that the sort of mode switching and the multimodal commuter. And I've actually been working with somebody or just in the early stages of trying to work with somebody from Queen's University to say, well, what data is there where we could say you travel on Monday by bike, on Tuesday by car, and on Wednesday you work from home or something like that. And I think the answer is that data is actually very difficult to come by because you need something for it to be reliable. You can't ask somebody that at the end of the year and say document over, remember the last year when, people like me can barely remember what they had for breakfast. But what people do in the transportation literature, they use trip surveys. So, I actually ask you this coming week, record every trip you make. But the issue is trip surveys are very expensive and very time-consuming to implement, so people who do them don't generally want to share that data with others because, they want to publish that, rightfully so, themselves. So a really good question, and I think there's more that needs to be done around how do we collect this kind of data where we don't assume a person does the same thing every day. Very important area of research. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Farrell Siegel. I work currently with Modo, a car share co-op here in Vancouver. I've also been fairly passionate about transit because I was responsible for designing a signal priority system put in here in Main Street and pulled out by Vancouver. Vancouver is also one of the only cities that have refused to allow Uber to operate in the city, as you may know. So there are multiple approaches to improving transit. You mentioned this evening, I was quite proud that the experience on transit is one of the most important things, I believe. Have you addressed this at all in that, looked at, why Vancouver is so difficult in certain respects? No signal priorities for transit vehicles, no Uber organizations which, have a huge taxi lobby, obviously, to put that out. But we don't seem to go in Vancouver for what is the logical things which are employed in other big cities in North America.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I might disagree with you a little bit on that because I think in many ways Vancouver's doing what, quote unquote, might be the logical things in terms of urban planning. So we've seen heavy investment in cycling lanes, for instance, right? And we know that there's a whole sort of generation of people who want to cycle more, I think. And so, I think Vancouver's, and I've been amazed since I haven't been here in maybe about 2.5 years or so. And just in those 2.5 years, the number of bike lanes that have been added and designated bike lanes and the bike signage, for instance, that I think works very well in a transit supportive environment. There's things like the car share, like Zipcar is more successful here than it is in other cities, and I think that's partly to do with, some people have raised this point before that car share works better in cities that have lots of transit because people don't use car share every day. They use it as one particular trip. Some of the other aspects that you mentioned, I don't think I can specifically comment on them because I'm just not familiar enough with it. But I'm happy to speak maybe later and be interested to find out more. Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Anthonia, and my question mainly relates to just, I guess, the data and the research that you collect, particularly around like the census data and the information that you have on hand in order to, define millennials or even just identifying income proportions and things like that. So I'm seeing the data from 2006 that you're putting up there, and I think I had mentioned something along the lines of, in 2006, like Facebook was like just barely kind of coming up. And when you think about millennials, things are changing really, really rapidly. And so my question is particularly around, again, the data and how quickly are we able to keep up with these changing demographics if we're looking at, the statistical data at 2006. We're in 2014. I understand that there is that census cycle, but how are we able to make appropriate planning decisions with that kind of demographic shift changing? And then I'm just going to kind of throw this out there as another, just in terms of just housing and millennials in general. You mentioned convertible housing in terms of a policy option. And then in terms of further research or something to look at as well, just the concept of condo stratas, being able to facilitate those types of mergers with units, also being able to change your use. So how planning has, how stratas have actually kind of controlled that aspect as well, and how they may be able to link with the planners and that. So that's it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good question. That second part, we could do a whole lecture on what do we do about the housing part of it. So you're raising some interesting points about that. And part of it is too, there's other options around the housing affordability, like co-ops that are not, housing co-ops, which some of them operate quite successfully, but are not always on the agenda anymore. But back to your data question, it's an important question for several reasons. The first is, while we often in long-term analysis have to sort of look at slightly what I'll call data, because that's just what we're stuck with, and particularly if you're thinking about rolling out, a census across the country. So that's the first piece, right? So the census, what it does for a researcher and what it does for me is I have the same kind of question across an entire country, so I can do comparative analysis. And so that's why I use it. But in my own research, we have more current data on these trends from specific cities. It's just they're not as neatly comparable because the city of Vancouver will have a survey on transit use, the city of Toronto will have one, and then different organizations. So we know that these trends have continued in that same direction. Just even though I'm sort of stopping at 2006, but the bigger question, which I don't know if I want to open that sort of can of worms, but is about the census, right? So a lot of this research that we do on this front relied on the long form census. And I'll be quite honest with you, I switched and include, there's a couple of reasons for that, but I study more of the American cities than I did in the past, in part because the data availability is now better for me. And so this is a very difficult and I'd say in many ways sad development of the state of public data collection in Canada, because it won't allow us anymore in the same way to understand at the neighborhood scale how our cities are changing. And when we're thinking about making investments in transit, making investments in housing and informing housing policy, how can we not have data like that is collected by the public sector? So I'll leave it at that, but thanks for the great question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Eric Doherty, and as you may know, we're going into or very likely in this region, going into a transit funding referendum. And there's a bit of an issue in that the generations that ride transit more tend to vote less. Mm-hmm. And is there anything that you can point out about reaching millennials, getting millennials out to vote, and particularly from U.S., any experience from U.S. cities that you know of where they have had transit plebiscites? You know, has there been success in getting younger voters to come out and vote for transit?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. I don't research specifically sort of the political science or the voting aspect of it, so I can't speak to it in that sort of level of detail. But when I research young adults and millennials, of course, one comes across writing on that sort of voting question, and I think the big thing that comes out of that literature is young adults want to vote on things that they feel like are going to impact them. And there's maybe a sense out there that a lot of the things that are being decided are really for baby boomers. Now, I'm not taking side on this, and I think this sort of leads to all these sort of intergenerational conflicts that are not terribly useful. But if we're saying that's the case, then something like transit will be something that millennials or young adults care about because they use it so heavily. So making it about, well, here's how your metro area will look like in the future, with or without different kinds of options, I think is one strategy. The other, that sort of, just off the top of my head is online voting, right? Yeah, those are options other jurisdictions are thinking about. With online voting, one has to be careful. There's, of course, also segments of the population that don't have easy access to computers, even though we're such a, online community. But in general, that may be something that would work. And then if we just sort of borrow from, the yes, we can strategies that Obama did, heavy reliance on social media is sort of what they used in part to mobilize a different kind of demographic, right? And so I think part of it is you got to go where the demographic is that you're trying to reach. I think that's maybe part of it. And somebody in an earlier discussion today brought up this notion of going more to post-secondary institutions, because there's a large share of young adults who are using transit to a great extent, partly because they have the transit passes, right? So going to universities, going to colleges, and urging people to exercise their right to vote. Whichever, when I bring this up in my classes, I always end the term by saying, go vote, and people sort of look at me, this wasn't the topic of the class, but I say, well, all the issues we talked about here today are influenced by public policy, right? And public policy gets made by elected officials, and if you don't go and vote, whether it's on an issue like a referendum or electing a person, you have no say in that direct sense. So sort of, urging people that voting is both a right but also a responsibility of citizenship, I think. Yeah.
My name is Meyer, and I would like to share with you an innovative idea that was initially started in the city of Tel Aviv, Israel. So I'll just give you a nutshell about this idea. The city of Tel Aviv wanted to encourage people to take the train or bus in order to get from the suburbs or adjacent cities to the city of Tel Aviv. In order to encourage people at every area where the train stops or bus stops, there are free bikes. So if you have a license and you can prove that instead of taking your car, you took the bus or the train, you then are able to get a bicycle. You simply get a token and you get a bike and you go anywhere in the city, and the same thing happens when you go back to work. And this has solved many of the traffic problems and pollution. I was wondering if this idea can be tried in Canadian cities.
That's an interesting point, and I think it relates to something that I actually, when I was in my undergrad, I had a professor, Ian Rowlands at Waterloo, who spoke, back in the 90s about shift in the economy where people are going to be using things more as services, and he sort of raised that example of transportation services. And I think, partly what your example is getting at, can you have a pass? I understand Metro Vancouver is now implementing the transit card. Can you have a pass where you get off the bus, you can use that same card to rent a bike? Can you use that same card to rent a car? Can you use that same card to get on various modes of transit, so that really what you're doing is you're providing transportation as a service, and people can then choose which specific element of that service they need for that day. Because many of us might need a car every once in a while, and we buy a car because of that. But if we had all the options available to us, we can sort of dramatically decrease car ownership and use. Yeah, so interesting idea. I'll look more into it. I'm curious to find out more about it. Thank you. Yeah, next question. I think person in the front.
My question pertains to youth voting as well, particularly for the neighborhood which I grew up in, the district of North Vancouver and the city of North Vancouver. It's become very apparent that not only is youth votership low, it's almost as if the people who are in office in their municipal governments are staying in office, and that's because there's no other options. So I'm just wondering, this may not be the case for the city of Vancouver, but I'm wondering whose responsibility is it for the youth to vote for people when there's no other options? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I do understand. So you don't like the options you're given? You're facing a constrained choice, right?
Well, it's like I think the mayor of North Vancouver has been re-elected into office by default 3 times in a row.
Right.
So
are you running for mayor of North Vancouver?
I wish, but should that be our responsibility as 20-year-olds, as 18-year-olds, as to be running mayor of a major district?
Right. It's a good point. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not sure. But I think there is a responsibility, to exercise your right and your responsibility. And so this, I'll call this, I don't know, sometimes students have asked me that same question, some students in my class, and I call this the tough love answer. And I think sometimes you just don't get the choice you want. Suck it up and vote for the person you think will be best within the people you've been, have been putting themselves out there. I think it's just, part of that is just realizing that we can't always get what we want, and sometimes we have to sort of make decisions that are not the perfect, but maybe there's somebody who fits generally with what I want to attain. So that's part of my answer, is sort of just we have to deal with that. And I take the notion of citizenship very seriously for a couple of reasons. One is that I came with my family to Canada as an immigrant and then became a Canadian citizen. So I actually had to take that official oath and everything. So this notion of rights and then responsibilities sort of were more present maybe to me. And there's responsibility to citizenship, and part of that is participating in the democratic process. And sometimes we won't like what's out there, but part of participating in a democracy is about voicing your opinion, and it's about having a say. It's not necessarily about getting your way, right? Otherwise we're in your dictatorship, your dictatorship, your dictator. Democracy is about having a say, not necessarily getting the way you think things should work. Yeah. So maybe not the answer you're hoping for, but I can't vote in North Vancouver, but I'll support you if you decide to run. I think person in the back was there first.
Hi, I'm Christine Voss. I have 2 comments really. So the first one. Before this evening, I haven't really ever come across the concept that young people choose transit so that we can use social media. I don't know the research behind this, but I would suspect this is a perfect example of correlation versus causation. We're already on the bus, we have time on our hands, so we might as well use it effectively. But my actual comment is regarding health, and this is something we haven't really talked about today. And my disclaimer is that I'm a health researcher with a focus on active transportation, so I have a very biased viewpoint, but very many people that I know in the city choose to walk because it's good for us. And it's a way to fit healthful physical activity in our incredibly busy daily lives. So I just wonder whether you could comment on health behaviors and choices in the concept of your presentation.
Right, yeah, it's an important question. I'm not a health researcher, so I can't comment on the specifics of that, but certainly health comes up over and over again when you're talking about active transportation, right? And, the point about wanting to be healthy and walking, I haven't seen that specifically tied to millennials or young adults. Maybe it's out there, but I just haven't come across it. But certainly more generally, people are making that link, right, between healthy lifestyle and walking. The other point is sort of about causation and correlation, right? So in primary schools, shoe size and math scores are are highly correlated, right? Because math gets better as people's shoe size increases, they age. But in this context, the survey, people were actually asked about their motivation, so it was more of a qualitative study. So we have some sense that the motivation is to use transit. But then the other part of that is maybe in this case, it doesn't terribly matter if it's causation or correlation because you've got them on transit. They're seeing that as a benefit. So I'm not sure whether in this particular example, usually there's all this caution, correlation, not causation. This may be one exception where maybe it doesn't matter that much, yeah. Person in front, person in the back, and then one more question after that if there's anybody else.
Hi, my name is Chris. Thank you for your presentation. It was very good. You did mention a lot about how young people of today, millennials, are moving a lot more towards transit nodes and towards the city center. But at the same time, if you look at this region and many other regions, most people still live in fairly car-dependent suburban neighborhoods, which are unlikely to become dense and highly served by transits. What are the trends with places like this? I live in one of them, so.
What kind of place? Where do you live?
I live in a fairly car-dependent part of Richmond.
Oh, okay. So can you just maybe rephrase your question? What's the specific question?
What are the trends with these places that are far from the urban centers as to millennials and where people are moving?
Oh, I see. So yeah. So I mean, as the map suggests, right? Millennials are moving to urban centers. They're not necessarily moving in large numbers to those more dispersed suburban areas. So that's sort of the overarching trend.
So what's going to happen to these places?
Oh, I see what you're asking. Yeah, okay. So what's going to happen to the single-family dwellings? Well, it depends what theory you subscribe to, right? There's sort of the doom and gloom where we say millennials want to live in cities, boomers also want to live in cities, so nobody wants to live in a single-family home anymore. I don't think that's going to happen. But there's maybe part of that could happen is that the demand for certain kinds of single-family homes may go down a little bit. And people are always worried about the condo bubble. Maybe there's something to be said about over-investing in single-family homes, given the way demographic changes have happened, where it's not just the millennials, but we're also seeing just generally a growth in the smaller households, right? So there is a growing demand for higher density urban form outside of just the millennial group. So yeah, what's going to happen to them? Well, there's people out there who have written things like the Sprawl Repair Manual, right? How do you densify low-density suburbs? And so there's all sorts of planning approaches to try and add transit and other modes of transport to those kinds of suburbs. So what's going to happen? Well, like I said at the beginning, those forecasts are usually wrong, but there's certainly lots of tools out there. So if you want to send me a note, I'm happy to sort of get you in touch with that literature.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation, Markus. My name is Matthew. I'm interested in specifically the Vancouver context, where you say there's a trend or there appears to be a trend that as millennials are aging and maybe their housing needs and requirements are changing, they're tending to move back out to those suburban areas. I'm wondering with to those auto-dependent areas. I'm wondering if if it's more affordable in those areas. Partly because we're still kind of subsidizing that, auto-oriented lifestyle. Maybe that the affordability doesn't take into account all housing and transportation costs all as one, right. And what kind of impacts might have when we start bringing some of those hidden costs to light, like we're talking about having a road or mobility pricing scheme in Metro Vancouver. How might the introduction of that kind of play into this affordability and where people are choosing to live in their different life stages?
Right, no, really good question. I don't know if you've seen Pamela Blai's book. It's called Perverse Cities. I always tell my students that not a book on the urban adult entertainment industry, but it's a book that talks about the incentives or what's wrong with the incentives around what kind of housing and transportation choices people make. So, an example is that if you live in the suburban home, as you described it, the costs of providing that infrastructure, whether it's the highways, the sewers, and all the other, stuff that goes to supporting and servicing a suburban home, that cost is very hidden, right? And so if you can make some of that cost more visible through things maybe like road tolls. Nobody likes to talk about road tolls, right? Because nobody wants to charge them. Maybe like road tolls, maybe tying property tax less directly to your, or taking some things out of the property tax and linking them directly to the things you're consuming. So you're paying maybe directly for the garbage that you're producing on a per bag fee or something, rather than having it be a lump sum, so that there's an incentive for the individual to change their behavior based on these economic indicators. And then there's sort of a caveat to that I always throw in, is that when you start charging like that, there are some people who will not be able to change their behavior because they're kind of locked into a particular urban context. So you can think about somebody having bought into a single-family home. That's what they could afford. They got their car. They're making things work. Now suddenly you're slapping a road toll on them. They may not be able to change their behavior. Now they're just being charged more for making the same lifestyle or making the same location and driving decisions. So one has to be sort of careful around assuming that these things are so perfectly for lack of a better word, changeable over time, because they're sticky, right? People make these location and transportation choices. We can't just say, here's a toll, now everything's going to change. But it starts getting us in the direction where we can send signals, right? And we want to be, I think, sending those kinds of economic signals, all the while being careful that we're not suddenly overtaxing low-income earners and sort of remaining that sort of equitable distribution of tax burden, so to speak. And to use the garbage example, I guess I shouldn't call it a garbage example. It's actually a pretty good one. Is if you're allowing people to use, you're charging them per bag of garbage that they're producing, but perhaps you're allowing a minimum of 2 bags or something like that, or a minimum of 1 bag for free, so that everybody has the potential to actually still put waste out, even if they can't afford it. And we sort of think, affordability, what's $5 for a garbage tag or something? But some people are living on such close margins that actually would make a difference as to what they can purchase. So great questions, sort of all around public finance and how that shapes cities. Maybe if we're lucky, TransLink will have me back in a month, and I'll do a lecture on public finance, which is...
One last question. Thank you. And thank you for sharing your information. It's been very informative and interesting. I actually have a question. I work in employee commuting and alternative commuting options. So I'm curious, have you come across research that shows millennials are making employment choices based on alternative commuting options, just like they might be making housing choices? So will employers have to look at the alternative commuting options and their accessibility to public transit as a way to attract the millennial workforce, which is, of course, one of the big questions that employers are facing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another great question, and it's one of those that I actually, is sort of on my list of, hopefully I'll get a PhD student to come and work with me, and so if you're interested, because what we need to do is have more direct analysis of this kind of trend. And what we're seeing, sort of in piecemeal evidence, we don't know for sure, but there's piecemeal evidence, sort of, examples. Google, for instance. So Google has an office in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I live now, and they are expanding their office, and they located right downtown Kitchener. And they chose an old industrial building, and the whole complex is actually labeled cool office space. And so all this sort of notion of that this place is cool matters, and its location matters, we were told, because Google knows, I think, well, it knows everything, but Google... Google knows that part of its workforce wants to walk to work. There's even a money you get back if you don't drive your car to work there, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing because they know there's less parking they have to provide. But I think that's sort of a small segment of the population that actually has that sort of, I'll call it bargaining power, because some of those workers are highly qualified, right? They're highly in demand. They're choosing between jobs in Silicon Valley, right in San Francisco, Boston, and Kitchener-Waterloo, we're hearing, which we're having sort of the conversation, how do we get a mountain and an ocean to Waterloo, because that's what we're missing, right? So there's sort of this question around, do they cater to them? I think more generally speaking, all millennials, if we're thinking about sort of their job experiences, a lot of them are just struggling to get into the workplace. So let alone having the ability to sort of be picky about, well, I love this first job I'm going to get. It pays well, but it's not near transit. I'm not going to take this. I'll go back to McDonald's, right? Yeah. I'm using an extreme example, but I think some people are doing that. But in the long run, I think, in the long run, we're all dead. But in the long run, employers, I think, will shift to that. I think because they're realizing their employees are looking for those kind of things. We're hearing lots, again, in the Ontario Kitchener-Waterloo context about making transportation and public transportation investments to connecting Kitchener-Waterloo with Toronto for reasons that people may not live close to where they work because it's more of a much larger regional labor market, but that people want to take public transit because they don't want to be on the 401, for instance. And if you've ever been on the 401, nobody really wants to be on there in general.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just also connecting to your data around the lack of car ownership, or maybe you didn't include that, but I know that, car ownership is decreasing, as well as the fact that they are not getting their driver's licenses, So if you then include a lot of transit, cost, both time and money, I think to me that looks like a big barrier to employers who are out in, an industrial park in Richmond. And I know that there are significant challenges for these industrial parks to retain high-quality employees. So I guess I was just curious if that connected to the millennials, particularly because of the growing trends within lack of car ownership and that type of thing. So
yeah, no, and I think it's a good question, and I think I would go back to there's some segments where employers know if they don't locate where their employees want to live, they're not going to get those employees because those employees have choice. And again, choosing Silicon Valley over Kitchener.
Yeah, sure.
But there's going to be, a lot of companies where I don't terribly care where I locate. It's more about transportation networks of, bringing raw materials to my plant, shipping things out. We have a lot of auto factories still along the 401 corridor, and we have examples of people having to commute up to 2 hours one way with their car to commute to the plant that they previously worked at that's now been consolidated into one larger plant. Those sectors of the economy, they know people need that work, right? And so, an interesting thing I'm just going to throw out there right now is, well, maybe there's something to be said about, bargaining powers of unions and thinking about the transportation implications of their employees, because not every employee has the sort of ability to demand certain things like a high-income, high-tech worker might. Yeah. So thanks for raising that. And I think that's probably going to conclude our talk today. And I thank you very much again for coming out and listening to me speak today.
Markus, thank you.